Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the longest undefended border in the world had suddenly become a battleground for economic warfare? This isn't a hypothetical scenario. It's the new reality unfolding between the United States and Canada. In the typically measured world of international trade diplomacy, a political earthquake erupted in Toronto. During what was expected to be a routine conference, United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered a message that sent shockwaves not just through the room, but across the entire North American continent. With uncompromising clarity, he declared that Canada's hopes for relief on steel and aluminum tariffs would not be met with any corresponding deal on the vital auto sector. There would be no free trade without tariffs, he asserted, framing a new reality where Canada must accept being second to the United States on autos. The message was stark and unambiguous. Cars would be assembled in the United States, not in Canada. This declaration was more than just a negotiating tactic. It was the articulation of a fundamental shift in American policy, an America First doctrine that threatened to unravel decades of economic integration and shared prosperity. The confrontation over the auto sector served as the flashpoint for a new, more contentious era in U.S.-Canada relations. Secretary Lutnick's stance was not an impromptu remark, but the deliberate expression of the Trump administration's core objective to repatriate manufacturing jobs and reassert American dominance. Under this logic, the intricate cross-border supply chains that had defined North American industry were no longer viewed as a source of mutual strength, but as a vulnerability to be corrected. The administration envisioned a new hierarchy where the United States would command the most valuable stages of production, particularly final vehicle assembly, while Canada would be relegated to a subordinate role, primarily providing raw materials and intermediate components. In Washington's view, this was simple economics. The United States, as the larger market with more capital and leverage, had the right to dictate the terms of the relationship. This policy aimed to force a realignment of continental industry, pulling investment and jobs south of the border through the blunt instrument of tariffs. The impact of this message was felt immediately in Ontario, the beating heart of Canada's auto industry. Premier Doug Ford, whose province's economic fortunes are inextricably linked to the sector, fired back with a ferocity that matched Washington's bluntness. He issued a clear warning. If the Trump administration intended to dismantle Canada's steel, aluminum, and auto industries, Ontario would not hesitate to use its own formidable leverage. In a move that reframed the entire dispute, Ford threatened to halt the flow of all Canadian resources southward. There won't be a grain of critical minerals going south of the border, he declared, adding, there won't be 1 ounce of energy coming from Ontario. This was not an empty threat. Ford's response was a calculated reminder that the economic relationship was not a one-way street. He articulated a strategic alternative, suggesting that the same cheap, abundant energy Ontario currently sold to its American neighbors could instead be used to power Canadian factories, making their goods more competitive on the global market. His message was clear. If the United States chose confrontation over cooperation, Canada was prepared to recalibrate its export strategy, seeking new partners and building a future less dependent on an unbalanced American partnership. This fiery rebuttal signaled that Canada would not passively accept a subordinate role. The confrontation was not merely about tariffs or assembly lines, it was about the future of the continent's industrial balance, and Canada was ready to fight for its place in it. The administration's hardline stance, however, seemed to ignore the deeply woven fabric of the North American economic reality. For decades, the continent's prosperity has been built on a tightly integrated supply chain, a complex ecosystem stretching from Detroit to Windsor, from Ohio to Ontario. This system was not designed by accident, but evolved to maximize efficiency and competitiveness. The auto industry, in particular, operates as a single continental enterprise. A component manufactured in an Ontario factory might be installed in an SUV assembled in Michigan, which is then sold to a consumer in Quebec. Thousands of trucks shuttle parts back and forth across the border every single day, feeding assembly lines that have functioned as one for generations. This interdependence is staggering in its scale. Ontario's auto sector alone employs over 100,000 people directly, with another 400,000 jobs supported across the vast network of suppliers, logistics firms, and service providers that crisscross the border. To Washington, tariffs were a tool to force automakers to relocate production. But industry experts warned that disrupting this finely tuned machine would be catastrophic for both sides. The Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association cautioned that severing these ties could drive up production costs by 10 to 25%. Such a spike would not only erase profit margins, but would also make North American vehicles less competitive against foreign imports, ultimately harming the very U.S. industries the policy claimed to protect. Beyond the immediate economic fallout, there was a significant geopolitical cost. Canada is a primary supplier of critical minerals, like nickel from Sudbury, which are indispensable for America's defense and high-tech industries, including the rapidly growing battery sector for electric vehicles. By alienating its most reliable partner, the Trump administration risked slowing its own nation's transition to cleaner technologies and creating vulnerabilities in its national security supply chains. The reality was that economic nationalism, when applied to such an interconnected system, was less a show of strength and more a self-inflicted wound. In its push to dominate, Washington risked dismantling the very foundation that had made North American manufacturing a global powerhouse. As the trade dispute escalated, it became clear that Canada was not merely playing defense, but was executing a multi-layered strategy built on patience, leverage, and a long-term vision for diversification. At the forefront of this approach was Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who projected a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the hostile environment. His optimism was not based on wishful thinking, but on a shrewd understanding of the political and economic pressures building inside the United States. LeBlanc and his team recognized that the tariffs intended to squeeze Canada were causing significant pain south of the border, creating a powerful source of domestic leverage. This internal American opposition was becoming increasingly vocal. Governors, senators, business leaders, and union representatives from across the country were pressing the White House to reconsider its aggressive stance. They were witnessing firsthand the negative consequences of the trade war. In the construction sector, lumber tariffs, layered on top of existing softwood duties, were making new homes more expensive to build, exacerbating housing shortages in many states. In the retail sector, new tariffs on furniture and kitchen cabinets set to reach 25% were being passed directly on to American consumers already grappling with higher living costs. Nowhere was the pain more acute than in the manufacturing heartland, the very states central to President Trump's political coalition. The duties on Canadian steel and aluminum raised the price of essential components that American factories in Michigan and Ohio relied upon to remain competitive. Companies began lobbying intensely, reminding policymakers that sustainable jobs depended on efficient, integrated supply chains, not just on protectionist slogans. This growing chorus of dissatisfaction from within the United States formed the first pillar of Canada's strategy. Ottawa calculated that as the economic costs mounted, the political pressure on the White House to find a resolution would become undeniable. Canada's negotiating stance reflected this patient strategy. While Ottawa demonstrated a willingness to find common ground, by rolling back many of its initial retaliatory tariffs, it refused to capitulate on core principles. It firmly rejected a deal similar to those accepted by the European Union and Japan, which involved accepting broad, across the board tariff ceilings in exchange for relief on specific products. Canada drew a different line, insisting that the sector specific duties on lumber, steel, and aluminum had to be addressed and removed directly, not traded away for a less favorable comprehensive agreement. However, the most resolute stance was taken on an issue of deep national importance, Canada's supply management system. For decades, this system of quotas and import controls has shielded Canadian dairy, poultry, and egg farmers from foreign competition, ensuring stable prices and incomes. It is a politically sacrosanct policy, particularly in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, where hundreds of thousands of families depend on it. American exporters have long targeted the system, viewing it as an unfair trade barrier. In the face of escalating American pressure, reports began to circulate that this system might finally be on the negotiating table. The Canadian government's response was swift and unequivocal. Minister LeBlanc publicly declared that supply management was non-negotiable. This was not mere political rhetoric. It was backed by the full force of Canadian law. In June of 2025, Parliament had passed Bill C-202, a landmark piece of legislation that legally forbids Canadian negotiators from offering any concessions on supply management in international trade agreements. This law, which passed with broad, multi-partisan support, created an unbreakable red line in the sand. The tool meant to force Canada's hand had instead rallied political parties around a unified defense, strengthening the very policy the United States hoped to weaken. Beyond the immediate defensive maneuvers, the trade conflict catalyzed a profound and permanent shift in Canada's long-term economic strategy. Minister LeBlanc described the moment as a hinge, a turning point where the old assumptions about the stability of the US-Canada relationship were cast aside forever. The days of the Mulroney-Reagan or Clinton-Chrétien era, when the rules of engagement were predictable, were gone. In their place was a new reality that demanded a new approach, a deliberate and accelerated push toward diversification. This was not just talk. The Canadian government began actively working with provinces, industries, and labor groups to steer companies toward new international partners. While the United States would remain its largest trading partner, it would no longer be its only indispensable one. Canada deepened its trade ties with the European Union through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, providing Canadian businesses with preferential access to a massive market. Ottawa also expanded its outreach across the Pacific, signing new agreements with partners like Indonesia and strengthening relationships with the United Kingdom and Mexico. This strategy was designed to create what LeBlanc called a virtuous circle. The more Canadian businesses succeeded in finding new markets abroad, the less they were held hostage by American tariffs. With reduced dependency came a more balanced negotiating position with Washington. This improved balance, in turn, reinforced the incentive to diversify even further. The Trump administration's attempt to tighten its control over its northern neighbor had produced the opposite effect. It had inadvertently pushed Canada to build the economic resilience and global network it needed to stand on more equal footing. The relationship was indeed changing forever, but not in the way Washington had intended. The most significant outcome of this high-stakes trade conflict was the series of unintended consequences that exposed the deep flaws in the Trump administration's strategy of economic nationalism. The policies designed to isolate and weaken Canada instead backfired, creating internal backlash in the United States and, ironically, forging a stronger, more resilient Canadian economy. The primary backfire was the profound miscalculation of the Canadian response. The relentless pressure from Washington intended to fracture Canadian resolve and force concessions achieved the exact opposite. It unified the country. Instead of dividing Canadians, the threat to core industries and policies like supply management rallied political parties, business leaders, and the public around a common defense. The passage of Bill C 202 was a powerful testament to this newfound unity, legally shielding a key sector from American demands. The strategy of intimidation had failed. In its place, it had fostered a national consensus and a determination to resist. More importantly, this external pressure became the catalyst for Canada's strategic pivot. The push to diversify trade was no longer a theoretical policy goal, but an urgent national priority. The tariffs forced Canada to confront its over reliance on the American market and take concrete steps to build a more independent economic future. In a supreme irony, President Trump's attempt to make Canada more dependent had become the very force that was making it less so. The secondary backfire, however, unfolded on a different front and with even more devastating consequences for the United States. It centered on the US China trade war and the American soybean farmer, revealing how tariffs, when wielded without foresight, can become a weapon turned against one's own people. The crisis began to surface publicly through a leaked text message captured in a photograph at the United Nations, which appeared to show Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins expressing grave concern to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about the plight of soybean farmers. For years, China had been the single largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, a market that was worth a staggering $12,600,000,000 in 2024 alone. In 2025, as the trade war with China intensified, those sales plummeted to zero. Not a single cargo of American soybeans had left port for China that year. The situation went from dire to catastrophic after a baffling move by Washington. The administration announced a $20 billion aid package for Argentina, a major agricultural competitor. Shortly after receiving this support, Argentina promptly removed its own export tax on soybeans and began shipping multiple loads to China, filling the very void created by the absence of American farmers. The result was immediate and ruinous. U.S. farmers watched as a market they had spent decades building was handed to a competitor, subsidized indirectly by their own government. Soybean prices collapsed, farm incomes plummeted, and confidence across America's heartland evaporated. What was intended as a show of strength against China had ended up severely undermining America's own agricultural producers. Hopes that diplomacy could repair the damage quickly faded. Despite 3 phone calls between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping and 4 rounds of meetings between trade representatives, the relationship remained at a stalemate. Both sides repeated familiar rhetoric about seeking stability, but neither was willing to compromise on core issues. Any potential agreements were limited to peripheral matters like a framework for TikTok or cooperation on drug precursors, leaving the central agricultural dispute untouched. For the soybean farmers waiting for their markets to reopen, there was no relief in sight. The tariffs that were supposed to create leverage had instead locked both nations into a costly freeze. The economic devastation was felt in real communities and by real families. Across Nebraska, Iowa, and the Midwest, farmers watched their balance sheets turn from black to red. The American Soybean Association reported that, with China out of the market, U.S. exports had fallen by almost 40% compared to the previous year. Soybeans were piling up in storage bins, driving up costs, while the average farm price slipped toward $10 per bushel for the 2025 to 2026 marketing year. For producers operating on thin margins, this drop was devastating. The crisis rippled through rural economies, affecting equipment dealers, trucking firms, and local banks. A trade strategy hatched in Washington had become a full blown financial crisis in America's heartland. Caught in the crossfire of this escalating trade war were the very symbols of American industrial might, the major automakers. For corporations like General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, North America had long functioned as a single borderless manufacturing platform. Their operations in Canada were not peripheral, but were core to their continental strategy, with a history stretching back over a century. These companies now found themselves in an impossible position, trapped between a protectionist administration in Washington and the unassailable economic logic of their integrated supply chains. The C suites in Detroit faced a daunting choice: absorb the massive costs of tariffs, which would cripple their competitiveness, pass those costs on to consumers, risking a collapse in sales, or undertake the monumentally expensive and disruptive task of relocating production, a move that would decimate their Canadian operations and alienate a loyal workforce and consumer base. Behind the scenes, a quiet but intense lobbying effort was underway as executives tried to explain to policymakers that their greatest strength was the very cross border efficiency the tariffs sought to destroy. This corporate level anxiety translated directly into deep seated fear in communities whose identities were forged in steel and rubber. In towns like Windsor and Oshawa in Ontario, generations of families had built their lives around the auto plants. The daily rhythm of life was tied to the shift changes and the constant flow of parts and vehicles across the Ambassador Bridge. Now, a cloud of uncertainty hung over everything. For a Canadian auto worker, the threat was no longer distant competition from overseas. It was a policy decision made just a few hundred miles away in Washington. The irony was particularly bitter for American workers in supplier plants throughout Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. The America First policies, ostensibly designed to protect their jobs, were now threatening them. A slowdown in a Canadian assembly plant meant fewer orders for the parts they produced, creating a domino effect that put their own livelihoods at risk. The conflict was not saving American jobs from Canada, it was endangering jobs on both sides of a once invisible border by disrupting their symbiotic relationship. Beyond the factory floors and corporate boardrooms, the dispute was inflicting a deeper, more lasting wound on the very fabric of the North American alliance. The relationship between the United States and Canada had always been more than just economic. It was built on a foundation of shared history, common values, and an unparalleled level of mutual trust. This trade war felt like a betrayal of that legacy. For the first time in generations, Ottawa was being compelled to plan for a future in which its closest ally was not a predictable and reliable partner, but a potential source of economic instability. This strategic reassessment was accelerating Canada's diplomacy as a middle power, as it sought to build a more diversified network of alliances with other like minded democracies in Europe and the Indo Pacific. The goal was to create a counterbalance, a safety net in a world where American leadership was no longer a given. The once special relationship was being fundamentally redefined, not by a shared threat, but by a self inflicted crisis with profound consequences for continental security and American influence for decades to come. This stark reality stood in sharp contrast to the direction Canada was heading. While American farmers were struggling, Canada was adapting. Hit by the same administration's tariffs, Ottawa's response was not to wait for a diplomatic breakthrough, but to accelerate its diversification. It expanded trade with the European Union, signed new agreements in Asia, and invested heavily in future oriented domestic industries like critical minerals and electric vehicle supply chains. The lesson was clear and undeniable. President Trump had promised to defend America's farmers, yet his policies had left them exposed and vulnerable. Meanwhile, Canada, once cornered by American pressure, was finding new ways to stand taller on the world stage. The backfire was complete, serving as a powerful cautionary tale about the real world costs of a trade policy detached from economic reality. The confrontation had not made America stronger. It had weakened its industrial foundation and impoverished its agricultural core, all while inadvertently pushing its closest ally toward a more independent and resilient future.